When discussing the Tudors and their involvement with the princes in the Tower, one question frequently arises. Why did Henry VII never search for them? A related question is why Richard III never publicly addressed the issue or initiated a search for them. Often, those posing these questions are less interested in the answers than in assigning blame. The absence of a search is seen as evidence of guilt on the part of Richard or Henry. However, when considering the lack of a search for the princes, it's crucial to understand the context of the time. A targeted search for the princes in the Tower was unnecessary. The Tower of London was a military facility, regularly patrolled several times a day. If the princes were alive or dead in an accessible area, they would have been discovered. The kings entrusted the Tower to their most trusted personnel. Richard III, for example, appointed Robert Brackenbury as its custodian, and under Henry VII, John de Vere served as constable. An intense search for the princes would have required considerable effort, involving excavation or the demolition of walls. Even then, it would have been unclear where to search within the vast tower complex. Digging up the entire tower was impractical. Starting from the known locations where the princes were last seen wouldn't have helped. They were reportedly quartered in either the Bloody Tower or the White Tower, though some suggest the Lanthorn Tower. Regardless, they were housed on an upper floor, making it unlikely they were buried there if killed, for obvious reasons. Anyone attempting to search for the princes would first need a clue as to where to begin digging or dismantling. We know of only one such clue. According to Thomas More, James Tyrell's confession in the spring of 1502 mentioned a stone staircase in the White Tower as a temporary burial site. I examined Tyrell's confession in detail in a previous video, concluding that while the traditional account is unlikely, it remains theoretically possible. If you're interested in the specifics, I recommend watching that video. Based on the available evidence, the Tudors would only have had the opportunity to search for the princes after Tyrell's confession, if at all. But did they? There is no record of any publicly communicated search. To address this, we need to approach the question differently, acknowledging that much of this discussion will be speculative. I will support my interpretations with sources as much as possible, though it's natural and healthy for others to disagree. My goal is to determine whether Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's behavior changed after the alleged confession in a way that suggests they were aware of it. Specifically, did they respond to the confession by initiating a secret search for the princes? To investigate this, I focus on financial records. Henry's account books are fully available online via the Tudor Chamber Books portal. These records reveal not only the King and Queen's movements, but also their interests and contacts. Some may wonder why the Tudors would have conducted a secret search for the princes in the Tower rather than addressing it openly. Why wouldn't Henry openly communicate this? To understand, we must consider the historical context of 1502. Publicly, the Tudors had consistently blamed Richard III for the murder of the princes. If they were to announce a search, it would not only reveal that they had yet to find any bodies, but also risk the possibility of not finding them at all. In the worst-case scenario, this could have exonerated Richard in the eyes of the public. The legitimacy of Tudor rule was heavily based on portraying Richard as a tyrant, with the fate of the princes being a crucial element in this narrative. At that time, Edmund de la Pole, heir to the House of York, was campaigning on the continent to be recognized as the legitimate King of England. An open search could have provided him with a perfect opportunity. If Henry failed to find the princes, de la Pole could clear the House of York of the accusations against Richard. If he did find them, Edmund could accuse Henry of the murder, given that Richard had been dead for 17 years. Thus, an open search was out of the question. Moreover, there was debate over whether a search was even necessary if Tyrell's confession was believed. Richard's guilt was generally accepted, which, in principle, was sufficient. However, I can speculate on two possible reasons why a search might still have been deemed worthwhile. Many close relatives of the princes were still alive, including their eldest sister, who was now queen. A successful search could have brought closure to the family by resolving the trauma of their disappearance. A successful search could have provided reassurance. After the experience with impostors, finding the real prince's remains could have eliminated the fear that they might someday reappear. But how could anyone secretly search for bodies in a place as busy as the Tower of London? After all, the Tower is constantly bustling with activity. The answer lies in using a construction site as a cover. A construction project not only allows for digging or tearing down walls, but also provides a convenient way to cordon off the area from prying eyes. It is well documented that Henry VII undertook significant construction work at the Tower, employing the architect Robert Vertue. This work began as early as 1501, before Tyrell's confession, and is therefore not suspicious as a potential cover. Records show payments from July 1501 for work on a tower within the Tower. Additional payments for this project are documented in October and November 1501 and March 1502. On November 2nd, 1502, Vertue was also paid for a new chamber in the Tower. In May 1503, he received payment for work described as upon a plot devised by the Queen. After this, Vertue continued to work for Henry, but not at the Tower. We can accurately identify most of Vertue's projects using a scale-drawn plan from 1597. The new tower within the Tower was located south of the Lanthorn Tower near the river and was known as the King's Tower. The new chamber likely refers to the Privy Council chamber in the Salt Tower. The plot devised by the Queen probably corresponds to the Queen's Gallery, connecting the Lanthorn Tower with the Salt Tower. However, in January 1503, payments began to appear for another new tower within the Tower, this time paid to Walter Forster. Vertue and Forster were working simultaneously. Forster, Henry's master of the works, was a royal master builder entrusted with sensitive tasks, such as repairing the tower in the 1490s. While payments to Vertue for the tower within the Tower span over 9 months, we only have payments to Forster from January 1503. However, there is an unspecified payment to Forster on May 13, 1502, just 1 week after Tyrell's execution. The amount was substantial, £117 and 20 pennies, but the details are vague, simply noted as upon a bill. The fact that Forster was working at the same time as Vertue has likely led to the assumption that their work was part of the same project. However, the 9-month gap between Vertue's last payment for a new tower and Forster's first is unexplained. The Crown was not facing financial difficulties as other significant expenditures continued. This suggests that Forster's tower within the Tower was a different project from Vertue's, and we cannot assign it to a specific location. This makes it a strong candidate for a cover-up construction site. So far, this may seem speculative, but it gains weight when considering historical reports. We know a tower within the Tower existed, and it was associated with the discovery of children's skeletons. John Webb reported in the mid-17th century that children's skeletons, aged 6 to 8, were found in a small room that had been walled up. These were initially thought to be the princes, but were later deemed too young. Webb, an apprentice to the master of the works at the time, left a plan of this tower within the Tower, which Annette Carson included in her book about Richard III. The plan shows a single floor, though this doesn't necessarily mean the tower only had one. Initially, this plan was mislabeled. C was noted as King's Lodgings, but it was later corrected to Passage to the King's Lodgings. The little room on the plan is where the skeletons were reportedly found. The staircase labelled Out of Cold Harbour is often associated with Cold Harbour Gate. However, this area south of the White Tower and north of the inner tower wall, including the Lanthorn Tower, was all referred to as Cold Harbour at the time, hence the gate's name. For a long time, the building on the southern White Tower wall was considered the most likely candidate for Webb's Tower. Known as the Fore Building, it's significant because it covered the entrance to the staircase under which bones were found in 1674. These bones were discovered during the demolition of this Fore Building. If we rotate the plan 90 degrees to the right, it aligns. The entrance comes from Cold Harbour, the south side has no doors as depicted, and C would be the connection to the White Tower. Critics of the Fore Building as Webb's Tower often point to the designation of King's Lodgings as referring to different buildings. But this is not the case in the middle of the 16th century. We are in the middle of a civil war. The Tower of London was in the hands of Parliament, and many on Parliament's side would have liked to have the King been housed in the prison cell in the White Tower at that time. This could explain it. However, this is not the only criticism of equating the Fore Building with the Webb Tower. It is also noted that this round tower is not on the plan. It is, most likely, the Ludwig Tower, which was later also called the Brick Tower. But it was a separate building, so why should it appear in this building plan? Another counter-argument is that Raleigh is said to have been an eyewitness to the uncovering of the children's skeletons. But since he was housed in the Bloody Tower, this could not possibly be true. Again, however, it is not quite so simple. For a long time, it was reported that Raleigh had found his prison in the cell in the White Tower. The strongest counter-argument against the Fore Building being Forster's Tower is its age. The Fore Building may have been constructed as early as the 12th century, during Henry II's time. It appears in a 15th century depiction of the tower and a 1663 depiction by Wenceslas Holler, the last surviving image showing the Fore Building. But this doesn't rule out the possibility that the Fore Building was Forster's Tower. If we return to the 1597 plan, which is known to be accurate, we see that the Cold Harbour Gate is significantly larger than the Fore Building. In the 15th century image, however, the Fore Building appears much larger, with the gate only hinted at. This discrepancy also appears in the 1663 depiction, where the south wall of the White Tower looks different from the 1597 image. Additionally, the Ludwig Tower appears in the 1663 image, but not in the 15th century depiction. We can conclude that the area around the tower's south wall underwent significant reconstruction between 1597 and 1663, including the Fore Building. The Jewel House, seen in the 1597 plan and built by Thomas Cromwell in 1532 during Henry VIII's reign, replaced an earlier structure from Henry VII's time, indicating that Henry VII also built in this area. Thus, the Fore Building is a strong candidate for Forster's Tower. It's a structure that would have required less construction time, making the timeline realistic. If the Fore Building is indeed the tower described by Webb, then the two walled-up children's skeletons found there cannot be the princes, as the building was completed in 1502 or 1503, when the princes would have been 32 and 29 years old, respectively. Therefore, the tower harbours another tragic story involving children that remains unknown. Another argument supporting the theory of a search for the princes in the tower centres on Henry VII's movements. We can account for his whereabouts almost entirely throughout his reign, with one notable exception. His location from May 3rd to May 6th, 1502, remains unknown. Before this period, Henry had been staying at the Tower with his wife, who departed on May 2nd. However, Henry did not leave with her. As I mentioned in the last video, the King and Queen were in the Tower at the same time as James Tyrell, who was sentenced to death on May 2nd, 1502, in London's Guildhall and beheaded on May 6th. Whether there was direct contact between Tyrell and the royal couple is uncertain, but it cannot be ruled out. Henry's presence in the Tower during his reign was typically reserved for special occasions. The long-standing belief that the Tower was one of his favourite residences has been debunked. However, his stay beginning on April 27th, 1502, seems to be an exception, as no special occasion can be identified. It's plausible to think that Henry and Elizabeth were there because of Tyrell, particularly since Henry had previously taken personal involvement in sensitive interrogations. It has long been speculated that Henry remained in the Tower until Tyrell's conviction. If Henry received the confession that More reported, he might have spent the period from May 2nd to May 6th, 1502, verifying it, possibly with the assistance of Walter Forster, who received payment a week later. While none of this can be definitively proven, the coincidences are certainly striking. The coincidences don't end with Forster's payment a week after Tyrell's execution. In the records from December 1502, we also find payments that raise further questions. Simon Digby received £40, though the purpose isn't specified. It is simply noted that he is of the Tower. Additionally, a priest is paid in the Tower without any stated reason, which is unusual since payments to priests typically included an explanation, such as in reward. For example, a week before the Tower payment, we have a record of such a specified purpose. The mention of a priest in the Tower immediately brings to mind Thomas More's account, in which a priest allegedly reburied the princes in a more dignified place. However, More also noted that the priest in question had already died by then. As for Digby, he was originally a Yorkist who switched sides to fight for Henry at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, after which he rose to the position of Deputy Constable of the Tower. One might speculate that he received the money to pay the Tower staff, but if that were the case, we would expect to see a corresponding entry, which we do not. Around the same time, Elizabeth made a donation involving Henry Langton, an old servant of her father, who had been a yeoman of the pantry in 1480. Earlier that year, Henry VII had also made a donation to an old servant of Edward IV, though the name of the recipient is unknown. To be candid, I don't know why Digby and the priest received these payments. It could be related to the approaching birth of the royal couple's last child, which was to take place in the Tower. However, given the temporal proximity to Forster's work on the new tower within the Tower, there might also be a connection. Purely speculative on my part, but it could have been payment for a new burial of the princes. Overall, it is striking how the past concerning the princes in the Tower preoccupied Henry VII and Elizabeth like never before during the year of Tyrell's stay in the Tower. In early December 1502, an entry in Elizabeth's account book mentions a prince, brother of the Queen, indicating that his nurse was considered. Around this time, Elizabeth was at Westminster, the birthplace of Edward V, nearly on his birthday, and made a donation to St. Edward, his namesake. She then gave birth to her new child in the Tower. There's ongoing debate among researchers about whether Elizabeth chose the Tower for her confinement or if it was an emergency solution due to the child arriving early. Originally, Edward V was supposed to be born in the Tower where everything had been prepared for his birth, but Henry VI's brief return to the throne forced the birth to take place in the sanctuary of Westminster. Could Elizabeth have deliberately chosen to give birth in the very place where she might have finally found her deceased brother? In another video, I discussed how Elizabeth remembered her brothers. Some sources even mention a son named Edward. This suggests that if her last child had been a boy, he might have been named Edward. Henry was also deeply preoccupied with the past during these weeks and months. In July 1502, he gave a donation to an old servant of Elizabeth's father, and in May 1503, almost exactly 20 years after Edward V's first coronation date in Westminster, he made a donation to St. Edward. It seems as if he was fulfilling a wish of his wife, who had since passed away. Individually, these events might appear coincidental and prove nothing on their own. However, at some point, the sheer number of coincidences becomes hard to ignore. This series of coincidences, beginning with Tyrell's execution, is particularly noteworthy. Elizabeth's commemoration after her death is also significant. When she and Henry had the bones buried, her mourning place in St. John's Chapel was almost directly beside them. The chapel directly adjoins the south wall of the White Tower. What is also striking is that after this period, the topic of the princes in the Tower seems to have been definitively closed at the royal court. No new impostors emerged, even though the timing would have been ideal. Elizabeth, the widely recognized head of the House of York, had died, leaving only the Tudors. Now, Tudor historians were free to craft their undoubtedly propagandistic narratives. A prime example is Polydore Virgil, commissioned by Henry VII in 1506 to write the Anglica Historia. Clearly, the king no longer feared that the princes might reappear and expose any inaccuracies in the accounts of their murders. It's worth noting that Virgil was sent to England in 1502 and remained there for almost the rest of his life. The fact that Henry VIII eventually named his much-desired son Edward, making him Edward VI, no longer posed any issues. Edward V would have been 67 years old at the time of the new Edward's birth, and theoretically, he could have still been alive to claim his throne. Yet, any such concerns seem to have been completely dispelled after Tyrell. To conclude, I would like to present a round of final speculations. After Tyrell's conviction on May 2, 1502, Henry received his confession. In return, Henry spared Tyrell the agony of a traitor's execution and had him beheaded instead. Henry conducted a search for the princes in the Tower with Forster until May 6th and found them to verify Tyrell's statements. This required a team of loyal individuals, which likely explains the payment recorded on May 13th, 1502. Subsequently, the royal couple decided to bury the princes with dignity in approximately the same place where they had been found. To facilitate this, the forebuilding of the White Tower was renovated. They may have hoped that one day the prince's remains would be discovered based on Tyrell's confession and given a dignified burial in Westminster Abbey, as indeed happened in 1674 and 1678, when they were buried. The new burial, commanded by Henry and Elizabeth, likely occurred in December 1502. Between July and December 1502, old servants played a significant role as they helped identify the princes and confirm that the bones truly belonged to them. As a result, I've revised my opinion based on these sources. The bones found in 1674 are indeed those of the princes. However, they were not buried by their murderers, but rather by Henry's team and their sister. This would explain why they were found buried 10 feet deep under a stone staircase, and why an anonymous report mentions that scraps of purple fabric, the color of royalty, were retrieved along with the bones. I now eagerly await your thoughts on where I may have gone wrong. I'm certain that many of you will disagree, and that's perfectly fine as long as we engage respectfully. The same applies to those who agree with my conclusions. As always, at the end. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content.